All right, just getting everything set up here. How's everyone doing today?
Doing good. Thanks for putting this together. Excited
For
to talk about
sure.
decentralized AI.
Likewise. Yeah, we've got a great lineup. Just gonna get everyone up here who's speaking, all set. All right, I think that just about covers it. All right, well, GM folks, thrilled to have you join us today. We are set to embark on a journey here into the heart of digital innovation and collective progress. Today, we'll be bridging the worlds of AI, crypto, and the burgeoning decentralized web to explore how, at its essence, the flow of data can catalyze collaboration, innovation, and societal advancement. Let's start with some introductions to lay the groundwork for the vibrant discussion ahead. Pleased to meet those unfamiliar with Tableland. This project, incubated by Textile, was conceived to open the metadata infrastructure for the realm of Web3, extending the utility and scope of NFTs, DAOs, games, and metaverses through a decentralized cloud database that empowers dynamic interactions and interoperability among digital entities. Rooted in the pioneering decentralized storage solutions of IPFS and Filecoin, Textile's quest has always been to enhance the internet's data layer. With the recent surge in DePIN and decentralized AI initiatives, our focus has shifted to developing tools like Basin, which combines verifiability, secure data access, and cryptographic integrity to offer scalable, efficient solutions for cutting-edge data applications. Stay tuned for some exciting updates on where our ecosystem, its partnerships, and collaborations are headed next. For today, however, we're here to glean insights from the trailblazers before us, to delve into the synergy between AI and the crypto landscape. We're excited to welcome Joel Thorstensen of 3Box Labs and the Ceramic Network, pioneers in creating a more interconnected, secure, and adaptable web through a suite of interoperable applications powered by a robust, verifiable data infrastructure. Delighted to introduce Ben Fielding from Jensen Labs, whose ambitious project aims to mesh global computational resources into an accessible supercluster, propelling the frontiers of machine learning. Warmly welcoming Doug Pitconix of LivePeer, innovators in open video infrastructure, melding state-of-the-art AI with streaming technology to redefine content dynamics. And happy to have David Minarsh from Valory with us, who is reshaping how communities and organizations interact with AI through the design of autonomous co-owned systems. Steering our dialogue is Jonathan Victor from ANSA, a luminary in reimagining the frameworks that underpin our digital existence. And with that, we're grateful for your presence and eager to dive into the discussions led by Jonathan and our esteemed panelists. Here's to an enlightening exchange that broadens our horizons and propels us toward a more connected and innovative future.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Brian. And great to meet everyone on the panel. I'm super excited for this discussion today. Maybe to start things off, it's interesting to me when I think about how crypto and Web3 intersect, because there's probably multiple layers when we talk about decentralization. So I'd actually be curious to maybe just go around the horn. When people think of decentralization as a premise, how do you think about that with respect to AI? Whether that be from like user sovereignty, whether that be from the supply side. I'd be curious where you guys think the most interesting intersection points are. Maybe Doug, I'll kick it to you first.
Sure. So just to make sure I understood the question there, it's what does decentralization mean, particularly in the context of AI and the intersection of AI plus crypto.
Yeah,
Yep.
maybe to frame it a different way, it's like if you were to talk to someone who is cynical or maybe apathetic about like decentralization, like what would be your pitch about why decentralization should matter to them in these systems?
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great question, right? I think if you look at what's happened in terms of progress in the AI world just in the last 18 months, with the rise of some of the fastest growing, most disruptive sort of consumer products like ChatGPT with these LLM models and diffusion models for generating images like Stable Diffusion and DALL-E 2 and whatnot. It's clear how impactful and disruptive this is going to be to our society. And if you look at the products that people are using and the infrastructure that's being used to run those products, you see an incredible amount of centralization. You see sort of the leading models being built by sort of closed proprietary companies, like ironically OpenAI, which is not not exactly an open company at all. It's closed and proprietary, and you see the infrastructure that's being used to power these products all being controlled within the same big corporate clouds, Microsoft in particular, Google and Amazon, of course, as well. And I think if you follow sort of the last wave of innovation on the internet and sort of the Web 2 era, and you saw what happened with the centralization of social media and information decentralization through platforms like Facebook and Twitter and big social media platforms, you see how risky it is when the same companies that control the infrastructure and the data and the access to our information and the user experience, how harmful that can be to our society in terms of things being corrupted by the sort of advertising and attention aggregation models, the control of information, what news is real versus fake, et cetera. And I think if we don't want the same thing to happen in AI, it's really important that we advocate for open models, decentralized infrastructure where people can run them on infrastructures of their choice, that are accessible in countries all around the world. And we can talk about many other topics, including regulatory risks and whatnot, as we go. But I think just as a starting point, it's critical that this really transformative, impactful technology be open access and decentralized, so it's not all in the control of the same couple big corporate big tech clouds in the United States only.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe David, just to pull you in here, I'd be curious. So I think like when we talk about AI agents, especially, how do you see like decentralization? Is it a requirement? If so, how would you formulate that to someone who maybe hasn't really thought about these topics as deeply?
Yeah, great questions and prior points. Well, firstly, it is relevant, for sure, and there's different, I think, flavors decentralization can, or forms decentralization can take when we think about autonomous AI agents. So, one form of decentralization is how human societies operate. Like we have, as individuals, like sovereignty over ourselves, our body, our thoughts, and we kind of interact in multi-agent systems as humans, right? And so every single agent, from the perspective of the whole, is sort of decentralized. So that's one way to build it, as well on a technical level. So you can have people own their own software agents, which represent them in certain domains, and sort of autonomously achieve outcomes for them. Another way to think about decentralization is sort of in this context is at the other end of the spectrum, where the autonomous agent is really like something which we share, which only sort of works as a collective whole. So that's still very abstract, but like think of a blockchain, right? There you effectively have the nodes come together, and only after certain conditions are met in terms of how the nodes interact, does it actually operate. And so we have taken these primitives and kind of applied them to autonomous agents. And so we have achieved like the ability for people to run autonomous agents as decentralized systems as well. So that's another way to think about decentralization, specifically with autonomous agents. And, I think in terms of why does this kind of intersection of crypto and AI matter more broadly? Maybe if I can just quickly comment on that. I think like one big thing is just that of like Web3 more generally, which is around ownership, which we implicitly and explicitly talked about, is ownership of data, ownership of algorithms, ownership of or control over the infrastructure on which it runs, right? And so if you can sort of as a user take ownership of your autonomous agent or your AI model or some other aspect, that has serves a lot of use cases very evidently, and I'm sure we'll unpack some of them. Another thing, speaking directly to OpenAI and the entrance piece. I mean, if you go to OpenAI, it's fantastic technology, ChatGPT, and then you kind of have these GPTs, and actually they're quite fun, right? Like people build kind of useful things there, but it's 100% platform risk. I mean, if you go and build something there tomorrow, some might decide that it shouldn't be there anymore, and then it's gone, and you can do nothing about it. So very clearly, there's a problem here as well. And then I think like the final piece I would add is around composability. So we often, I mean, we are very aware of this in Web3, but like composability takes different shapes. So you can think of like your, super slick Web2 REST API, which often like sort of from a user experience point of view might outperform anything we can offer in Web2, but you're basically restricted to whatever that company has implemented. Whereas one cool thing which Web3 offers us, and more generally a sort of decentralized approach to building, is that you can have composability in a way where the original creator hasn't really intended exactly how it's being composed. And that creates a much richer design space, which again, we are definitely solving a problem here. So that was a lot. Hope it wasn't too much.
No. That was fantastic. Well, maybe Ben, also to pull you into this discussion, I know on the Jensen side, one of the things that you guys focus on is sort of decentralization from the perspective of sort of expanding the supply side for compute. I'd be curious, what your perspective is on this.
Yeah, sure. I think to us, decentralization achieves or kind of solves two main things. One is that efficiency of resource allocation needs a bunch of resources. It needs hardware for training, it needs data, it needs people to put in expert knowledge in how to design models, etc. So there's a lot of kind of like downstream things that are required before you can go and build AI models. And what we've seen over the past 5 to 10 years is various companies come in and control aspects of those resources in order to be the only person that can do the kind of AI. And then they can make large amounts of money by sort of squeezing the supply at the kind of bottom end, and then being the only people that are then able to serve the market. Decentralization essentially allows us to unlock a lot of those resources by drastically lowering the barrier to being a supplier of the resources. So for the Jensen example is, if you have a GPU right now, for you to become a kind of GPU provider to somebody in the market, it'd be very, very difficult for you to sort of connect that up and start acting as AWS. Like there's loads of things that you have to be able to do that. You need support, you need infrastructure, you need customer service people, you need legal contracts, etc., that just kind of squeezes you out of the market. And the only people that can do it are people who can amass enough resources in order to be able to offer that out. Whereas with decentralization, we can build open source tech that solves a load of those problems programmatically and just allows people to join as a supplier of one of the resources. It doesn't just have to be kind of GPU hardware or compute hardware. It could be data and other things. But it makes it a much more kind of liquid market. That's the way we think about it, for the resources underneath, and generally drastically improves the efficiency of the whole market itself for AI. So that's one piece. That's probably the most important piece in our minds, because it unlocks some really interesting things in the future. If you think about, okay, right now, a machine learning model, when it needs to access resources, it needs to have like a company attached to it, and the company will go out and kind of get those resources, versus if you just had a model running in the cloud and it could trigger the training of another model just programmatically on chain. That's really interesting. And if it can do that at a much lower price than it currently can, it creates this entirely new world of much more open kind of model driven applications. So instead of interacting with a website of imperative code, you're interacting with a model directly, and that model can sort of act as an agent in that way, because it has all of the resources. So super exciting when you decentralize the things that sit underneath machine learning. The second piece that I alluded to at the beginning is that social piece. So who controls AI? And I think that's a piece where decentralization comes in again. Right now, we're seeing a lot of bias go into the only models that people can use in the world, like OpenAI's ChatGPT models or some of the newer competitors. But if we can increase the liquidity of the resources underneath, we can increase the number of people who can build these models, and we can make a much richer ecosystem of models where I can choose which bias I want to interact with. And at Jensen, that's the way we think the future of AI should be. It shouldn't be this one model designed by one company that tries to be the kind of bias of everyone. It should be anyone running any model. And when I come along and look for the model I want to use, I just look through them all and I say, hey, no, that one's completely conflicting with my views, but that one isn't. So I'm going to use that one. Or maybe none of them are, and I should make my own, and other people will come and use that. So I think once we solve those resource problems at the bottom, then we can solve those kind of like social, almost like governance problems over the top of AI models. But the first thing has to happen first, in our view. We have to unlock some of the resources because they're how that control happens.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. Maybe to like double down on this sort of like line for you and Doug, since I know both of you focus quite a lot on sort of like the supply.
I don't know if it's just me, but you are super quiet.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh, that's better. Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, maybe to sort of double down and just focus for you and Doug, since you both think a lot about the supply side. So decentralization and centralization exist along spectrum, usually coming with trade-offs in terms of efficiency. And so I'm curious, as you guys sort of focus on sort of expanding out the supply side, what challenges do you see in building services that make it possible to sort of like take that aggregated supply side and make it accessible to a broader demand side?
Yeah, that's
I
a
think
good
that's
question. That's been
go ahead,
a journey we've been, sure. That's been a journey we've been on for about 7 years or so at LivePeer. For those who don't know, LivePeer is a video infrastructure network. Initially, people would contribute their compute power to perform video transcoding, and now increasingly they're contributing it to perform not just video transcoding, but sort of generative AI video compute task as well, to generate things like what you've seen in Sora demos, where you can give a prompt and generate video or image outputs. And so, to your question about sort of aggregating supply in order to actually meet the demands of the market, one thing we learned is it's not just a if you build it, they will come scenario. Because you could rewind 6 years ago and said, hey, LivePeer's had a infrastructure network with robust supply, where a bunch of providers showed up because of crypto incentives to put compute capacity on the network. And yes, this capacity can transcode video effectively, but to actually bring on real demand and to make sure that fees are flowing to the supply side as well, you have to productize and you have to meet the market where it is. You still have to make a product that people want, make sure it fits in with the way that people want to consume these resources. And so, we've taken the approach of putting a full-featured full-stack video developer product on top called LivePeer Studio. And as we push into the video AI space, we constantly ask the questions, what product do people want to use when it comes to generative video? Because it's one thing to say, you can run a node where you give prompts and it gives back raw assets. It's another to say, how are people going to use those in their video workflows? How are they going to store them, stream them, get analytics on them, play them back, combine them with other tools, et cetera. If you want the supply side to be fed, if you will, you have to also focus on the demand side, even though crypto gives you great tools to bootstrap a supply side in the early days.
Ben, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that.
Just very kind of similar thoughts. I think at the end of the day, it's really tricky when you're building something so kind of new and so like deeply technical that you will have opinions that things could be done in a completely different way, and you have to pick which of those you want to drive forward and which ones actually it's better to sort of follow how people currently use things. It's better to sort of come to the users themselves rather than try and create this like panacea of the future when actually people wouldn't adopt that because for whatever reason it doesn't solve their problems right now, or maybe it's just too different from what they currently use. And I think it's the challenge of any sort of like deep tech company. It's not new to decentralization. It's just that decentralization happens to be this kind of suite of technologies which is quite different. Like you have to build things differently. And so the balance for any company building something in this space, particularly like the deep tech, more infrastructure companies, is to pick the battles where you want to be highly, highly opinionated and say, you know what, we have to change the way we currently do X because it will be significantly better if we do. And we're going to have to bring users users on the journey with us to that. And in other areas, actually, no, it doesn't make sense for us to be hyper opinionated here. We should follow kind of how users currently do things. And I think the only way you do that is just keeping a really open, constant dialogue with users. And like Doug said, like testing products constantly, testing ideas and getting that feedback and iterating on it. But it's a balance between that and then kind of innovating on super new, super deep technologies. It's a hard balance.
Yeah, Ben, I have a question for you, kind of on the supply side, more so than like this demand aspect we were just talking about. But one thing in traditional like DePIN networks and the DePIN thesis is that, hey, there's almost infinite supply out there that's being underutilized, right? If you look at storage networks like Filecoin, they make the case there's so much unutilized hard drive space out there. If you look at LivePeer, we would have said, hey, there's all these millions of GPUs deployed that have video encoding chips that are sitting idle in these consumer grade GPUs. But when we look at the AI space in particular, and particularly in training, which I know you guys are focused on, you're actually not talking about an unlimited supply of resources. There's actually like a scarcity right now. People can't get their hands on enough A100s, H100s, the new generations of cards that are coming out that are required for training models. Do you see it's a different challenge in terms of actually being able to bootstrap the supply using economic incentives because the hardware just doesn't exist out there?
So there is and there isn't a scarcity. Yes, we do need more chips in general. Like the demand for machine learning compute is absolutely enormous. And it's one of those things where the more supply exists, the more people will do it. As a technology, AI/ML unlocks so many things. Like it's just generally an enabling technology for essentially every kind of area of technology that we interact with. So I think there would never really be a kind of oversupply of that hardware because we would just do more machine learning. We just add it into more areas. So in that way, yes, there's a shortage of supply. But if you look at the market dynamics right now, there is a lot of supply that's kind of not efficiently used. Like it's either sat idle waiting for a user, or it's moving between owners, and those owners need to set up infrastructure, and it's kind of being bought and it's being put into a data center, but they need to sort out the contracts and need to go through sales processes and things. So we view two solutions to that kind of shortage that we talk about. One is we just have to make more chips because the usage is going to increase and increase and increase. And the other is we just have to make usage of what we have currently way more efficient. So I think the infinite supply points for any other area, it's never really infinite. It's just talking about efficiency. It's just that generic kind of compute can be seemingly infinite, and specialized compute is a bit more constrained. But we view the same problem. It's making more efficient usage of the hardware that we currently have. And then as we increase the hardware supply, that's more efficiently used as well. So it generally kind of just smooths our usage of humanity's resources overall. A second piece is we do believe that the kind of specialized nature of machine learning compute hardware is a bit overblown. It's true that a lot of the kind of the newest models, they generally require pretty new GPUs because they assume that you have a large amount of VRAM on board and they need kind of to process really quickly. But actually, a lot of the time you can use stepped down in terms of kind of power hardware and take a performance hit. Maybe it takes a little bit longer. Maybe you have to split the model up and you're going to have communication costs that you wouldn't otherwise have, but you can do it. So one of the big goals of Jensen is to commoditize machine learning compute. It's to stop us thinking, I have to have an NVIDIA H100, and make us think, hey, I need to do a bunch of operations in order to train my model. Where can I do them? Maybe I do them on an H100 because at the moment that's the best balance of cost and performance that I need. But actually, maybe I do it on 1,000 MacBooks because that's a better balance of cost and performance for me. So one of the points of Jensen is to do that process, is to say, let's stop thinking we need the latest and greatest hardware in order to train our models, because at the end of the day, all we're doing is taking value in data from the real world and putting it into model weights. And we can do that in lots of different ways in a much more sharded way if we're just a bit more deliberate about it and have an infrastructure that lets us do that, rather than the current way of just saying, well, I have to train the biggest model I possibly can and this is how I train it. I need 1,000 H100s in a data center co-located. There's no other way. Because realistically, that's not true. That's kind of the sort of first way of doing it. And then we figure out the other ways.
Yeah, I think, very, very interesting point about the perspective about sort of the sharding and the distribution of the capacity across consumer hardware. But I think I'm with you in terms of efficiently making use of this high-end hardware that's already been deployed. Because like if you can only get H100s by doing a $100 million plus buy, and then you can only, a tier down if you can only access it from those purchasers by doing a year commit for a significant amount of capacity. There's no way a startup that's doing a year commit is utilizing what they reserved at 100% capacity all of the time. So even though it's hard to get your hands on these things and you have to pay a lot to do it, there must be so much that's sitting underutilized that could be put to use on these networks if these networks present the opportunity to drive sort of economic value to those who have already made the investments.
And maybe just to underscore that point a little bit, I think a couple weeks ago there was a report about stability and sort of its economic situation, and I think like one of the biggest like drags on their balance sheet was they had overinvested in hardware and they were trying to figure out how to monetize. So I do think, especially as we like move past, I think this initial wave of like early sort of like massive acquisition of hardware from some of the early AI startups, we'll see more and more demand for people to just try to monetize in more and more ways. Maybe to loop Joel, you into this conversation as well. We've been talking a little bit about what's needed to sort of build composability between sort of like the hardware resources. I think one thing people sometimes underweight is that data itself is also a resource inside of these systems. And so I know at Ceramic, you guys have done a lot of thinking about what's needed for data interoperability. I'm curious, yeah, how do you think about sort of like the different types of standards that we need to adopt and sort of what pathing we can sort of like build towards if we want to start allowing users to be more like involved in the ownership and contribution of their own data sources into these systems?
Yeah, so it's funny. The original question you asked is like, what is the intersection of crypto and AI? And I feel like we touched on some of the things in sort of more lower level hardware, but it feels like crypto also has a role to play in sort of how we as a civilization can actually adapt to AI technology, because there's the hardware and like the compute of how we make the models happen, but then there's also the consequence of the models, and they can be used for a lot of good stuff, a lot of bad stuff, and in a lot of the bad stuff it's like impersonation and things like that. And this is actually something that the crypto space, since the early cypherpunks, almost for like could see in the fact that like with public key cryptography, we can actually change the structure of society. And I think that sort of becomes more of a necessity for us to build these sort of web of trust systems in this new world of AI. So I think that sort of points to this world of like both for the inputs for the model, but also for the outputs and provenance, like who actually produced the data set that was used for the training. It's not just like one individual, one organization, right? There's a lot of things that come into that. But I think that like going and doing digital archaeology on like everything that has gone into models are going to be really hard. I think we as a crypto community probably will have an easier time to sort of more plug into the outputs of the model and the trust we build between ourselves as we are using models and agents to sort of act on our behalf and build this sort of web of trust that is sort of the promise of Web3, but we haven't really gotten to yet. But I think the interesting thing is that the with all these like generative capabilities that AI gives us, it becomes more of a necessity. Yes, I think that's like the thing we haven't, the last piece of the puzzle on like the crypto AI intersection.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe, Andrew, I don't know if we allowed you to give your own intro as one of the co-founders of Tableland and Textile. But I know you and I have talked quite a lot about sort of like users and data DAOs and what that might look like. And especially in the wake of, I don't know if people saw, there was this project, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that launched Reddit DAO, which tried to incentivize users to download their Reddit data and upload into the DAO. And it got me thinking a little bit just about how inside of Web 2, with the wave of AI, I think a lot of companies started updating their terms of service, their end user licenses, to basically like prohibit AI companies from just scraping and extracting what they viewed as their data. Obviously, it's a little bit ironic since many of these companies are sort of just aggregating and repackaging data that users have contributed. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what are the sort of missing pieces in order to sort of enable users to actually be quote unquote owners of their data.
Yeah, wow. Hi, everybody. I was actually here for technical support. Didn't expect answer questions. I figured today, surrounded by people that think about this a lot more than we do and have hands-on with these challenges of AI in decentralization. So anyway, excited to chat with you all. Yeah, that is a super tricky problem. I mean, that is another example of a question that is just better suited to the problems that are to the projects that are kind of at the forefront of how do you embed information into model outputs, for example, about where training data came from. How do you have like certainty in that flow? Because the transformation step that we're seeing, for example, from training data to like vector databases is like pretty hard to address with just simple, hashing techniques and verifiable data structures. But I think we can address a lot of it collectively. There's a lot of tools that we can start to deploy more effectively, just as simple as like transparent and robust protocols where we can see how data goes in, what data comes out, and how they're connected through provenance and changes. I think the Reddit DAO that's interesting and kind of opens up another tool in our tool bag, which is just better participatory governance on what models we're even owning as a community and ecosystems and how they can be deployed and what happens to the outputs of those models and how those need to be tracked. So a lot of them, in my mind, are indirect solutions to just being able to have a direct data-based tracking of lineage and ownership and all of that. But it's a really tricky problem. I don't have a great answer for it now. I know this is another one that Joel actually thinks a lot about, so maybe he has some other more immediate thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I mean, since you mentioned vector embeddings, I think the interesting thing there would be if we could just have like a fully decentralized vector index that was sort of trustless. I think that's very hard to do in general, since a lot of models are closed and we can't really like do anything meaningful with it. But I think for like smaller models that are open, in theory, it's possible to generate validity proofs that, hey, this data that has this hash actually produces this specific vector for this specific model. And we can store that in sort of a global index. And we can make that sort of publicly open search for anyone that sort of can use that model. For models that are not open in that way, that becomes more tricky, but possible if you have some sort of certain actors you would trust to do those embeddings and just like ingest vectors from only those actors. And I'm sure there are like federated ways to do that as well. But I think these like open semantic search approaches are really interesting to explore more.
Yeah. Maybe David, so we've talked a little bit about sort of like, I guess, how some of the economic flows change more from maybe like the value chain side. I'm curious if you've given any thought to AI economic agents And given their potential to disrupt traditional business models, what maybe the potential unintended consequences of this shift might be, and what actions can we take now as we're designing these systems to hopefully build towards more equitable outcomes?
Yeah, great question. And if I may, I'll also touch back on some of the previous points. So I think first, I think there's one thing might be a bit controversial because we're all big proponents of Web3 and crypto, but I think generally speaking, it's technology for machines, not humans, because it's so complex, because it requires, like, ownership requires responsibility, and responsibility, we often don't have the time for it, and we don't want to be encumbered by the UX challenges which come with that responsibility. And so actually, I think what's so fantastic about this intersection of crypto and AI is that we can retain ownership whilst lowering the kind of effort we have to make in order to, own our own systems and then interacting with those systems. So that's the big promise of using autonomous agents in particular, on top of experiences which involve, like, Web3 technologies, being your own bank, all the way to, interacting with all the various DAOs and the products. Because we very clearly see, if you have this sort of interacting paradigm where, there's a dApp and it's very trustless or trust minimized, and then I need to go to this front end, I need to overcome all the UX challenges which come with this, and then I very often need to do a lot of things. And I think the thing is, people say, oh, we should, borrow from Web2, and, like, really we're just running after a wave which has already passed us, right? Like, the mobile app experience is something of the late noughties, early 2010s, right? And, like, what we want to replicate, that's not going forward, that's going backwards. So really what we want to do, in my opinion, is we want to go past this interacting paradigm and much more to an outcomes paradigm, right? Like, generative AI and, like, other forms of AI, when embedded in the context of autonomous agents, allow us to consume full outcomes. They can abstract a lot of the interactions which we have to painfully do with dApps and other kind of web application, whilst allowing us in principle to retain ownership. So I think that's where we should be heading, because then this means that every user can have an autonomous agent that creates, simply put, value for them. That value can be purely financial. It can be in things which are more inspirational, like attainment of knowledge. It can be around your health and so on. I think that is a desirable kind of end goal or destination. And so if we have that, then let's think about these negative implications, right? Like a world where increasingly we have powerful models, AI models, which we can query, and then increasingly a push for these models to themselves to become agentic, and agents being built around those models. It is very worrying if this all happens in a very centralized setting. Why? Because before I'm worried about paperclip maximizing and other problems like this, which are at length and somewhat boringly discussed everywhere, I think the bigger problem is the economic challenges which happened way before that. Because obviously, these are the really concrete problems people will face when they will lose work or not even find work, when they lose the meaning of their work because it's being replaced by machines and they have no way of attaining new meaning. So really, it's about thinking, okay, well, how do we create, paradigms and, like, economies and governance structures where people can live a fulfilled life alongside these very powerful software agents that do things on our behalf. And I think the only way we're going to achieve that, like, there's a lot of design challenges there, which, we can cover endless hours, but the only way in principle we achieve that is if we share out and distribute the ownership of said systems. If all these systems run on the cloud clusters of, like, 3 or 4 technology companies, and as Ben was saying, are controlled by their biases, and we can never take real ownership, there's zero way we're going to have equitable economic outcomes. And like a UBI, where all have to ask Sam to have a bit of money, to have a bit of fun. This sounds like the most disastrous outcome I can imagine. So it's not a solution either. So I think, simply put, kind of decentralizing the ownership of powerful AI is probably in the interest of the 99%, including a lot of governments. And so it's probably more of a coordination issue than a will issue to get us there.
Well, maybe to sort of just pull on that thread a little bit, I guess so the two industries, I guess, that have maybe the most regulatory attention right now are like AI and crypto. And so maybe, David, I'm curious if you have any thoughts, but then maybe pass it off to the rest of the room. From your guys' perspective, what do you see as maybe being the ideal way that governments and regulatory bodies could engage in these topics? Where do you see it being their role to maybe step in? What are the things that maybe make sense for them to control versus things that maybe should be just pushed more from a software lens?
Yeah, I think governance is always the hardest problem, actually. And so I don't claim to have the perfect answer, but what seems rather dull is these sort of arbitrary restrictions on compute or data, whatever measure you pick, it seems somewhat arbitrary. And we, generally speaking, I think if you look at the history of humanity, there tend to be the most stable phases when there's relative peaceful economic competition, right? If you create environments where people can put their competitive nature into the market competition, then not everything's perfect, but this market competition keeps things in check and balance. And I am thinking that we should create the same for this era. I don't think in principle anything changes, whether our economic participants are of flash or digital. In practice, there's a lot of challenges, but therefore I would say this push towards this general notion that things should be open source, that we should prevent innovation just happening in small clusters in a closed source context, seems desirable. And obviously the current incumbents don't want that, because they win a lot if they prevent the open source environment to catch up.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because I feel like there's maybe echoes of what we've seen play out over the last, call it, decade with social media, which is probably a foreshadowing of things that we'll see with AI as well. I'm curious, Doug, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. I think I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say it's a hard question to answer of what regulators should do, except maybe relax, take a step back. This is moving very quickly. Understand it before you try and regulate it. Stick to your initial mandates of fostering and enabling environments for innovation, healthy competition, economic gain for all, not just the incumbents, right? I think they should be principles guided in ways that actually stand a chance to benefit humanity, rather than fear guided and sort of overreacting to negative risks that are presented in the media, for example. I think it's obviously bad if you're preventing access to the world's most disruptive technology to the the millions of innovators and explorers and pioneers that want to try and create disruptive creations out of it that benefit all of society. And you think that should only be that ability should only happen within the few entities that are big enough and have the big enough legal teams to comply with arbitrary regulations around, as David mentioned, the amount of computing power you're putting into training your model or the size of your data set. Things that obviously no startup would have a chance to comply with, despite all the evidence that shows how innovative independent startups have created the big disruptive positive impacts to society over and over again over the years. So I would urge caution. I would urge moving slowly. I think we want to support innovation here and around the world. And I think, not just the US government, all governments would be wise to open up this technology, ensure there's equal access to it, and create environments for innovation.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I know, I don't know if I've heard people say this more recently, but I know, one of the long-running streaks in crypto is sort of talking about, this geospatial lottery that some people have won, and, how do we create systems that are more democratic, more open, more accessible. And I think, even when we talk about, Ben, as you were mentioning, just the ability to, make a trade-off, if you look at the bottom 6 billion people in the world, cost is one of the biggest factors. And so making a trade-off to be able to run a model and have that happen, maybe it's dramatically cheaper, but dramatically slower as well on 1,000 MacBooks. That may actually be much more reasonable if you're coming from maybe a less wealthy country. So I think just in terms of making these systems more accessible, there's a really important thread there. I know we're getting close to the end, and I want to make sure we have some time for folks in the audience if they have questions to ask all of y'all as well. But maybe I will ask one last one before we open it up. I'm curious, are there any AI agents today that folks have been playing with, or any AI tools that maybe you as individual experts would pitch to everyone else to go play with? Maybe, Ben, I'll kick it off to you.
Yeah, I guess the kind of the most interesting ones typically take everybody by storm. So we all end up using the same things, but some of the really interesting things I've seen recently are back to the more swarm-based autonomous agent experiments where you put just a bunch of agents together in some kind of simulated environment and then just sort of see what emerges. I don't know if anybody went to it, but I didn't go to this, but I saw it kind of on Twitter. There was an event somebody's running in San Francisco where you sign up, you create an agent based on you. So you train a model based on I think your social media content or something like that. And the event is 3 days long. And the first 2 days are purely virtual. And they're the agents of every individual who's signed up, just interacting in this sandbox. And then the idea is the third day is in person, and you turn up and you have the history of your agent and who it's talked to and kind of who it got on with, who it didn't get on with, maybe who it argued with, who it found really interesting. And then you go to the event and you essentially see if that's true. You talk to all of those people and you see, hey, our agents interacted and had an argument. Do we actually have that argument as well? Let's kind of dive into it. And I found that absolutely fascinating. I think it's a really, really interesting experiment. And I know there's other companies doing this where they'll just make hundreds of thousands of these agents and put them in this environment and then put in observability tools. And so we as users can log onto the website and watch it through a Twitter stream or through, I don't know, a top-down map view or something and watch them go about their day. I think probably the most interesting thing is it triggers lots of people's memories of games where you would play these kind of town simulators or something, and you have to go and talk to people and interact with them, but it's just always happening and it's always going. Just jumping back to some of the autonomous agent chat from before, I think one of the most interesting things in my view, about the idea of us creating autonomous agents is I think it's a natural progression of technology, and it's a natural progression by us expanding the environment they can operate within. So what we've had so far within autonomous agent research is people creating these sort of constrained environments and then creating an agent that can interact in that environment and sort of showing interesting results. But as we build more infrastructure, we basically build a kind of real world human environment for autonomous agents to live in and interact in. And crypto and decentralization as a technology did that for financial means really early on. It basically said that autonomous agent, like a smart contract, is exactly the same as a person within this environment, this on-chain kind of transaction-based environment. And we can now bolt on any other things to that. So real-world assets can be attached, and then the agent can sort of interact with those, and compute can be attached, and then the agent can interact with those. And I think just as we build more and more infrastructure, technology will just build agents for that. Whereas before, we've had to try and sort of build them. We've had a view of what they could be, but we've had to build them around the real world. And that's where you get things like the Google Assistant, where when you want to book a restaurant, it like phones the restaurant with a normal landline phone, and then the agent has to sort of convert text to speech and have a conversation with that person. Like, it becomes this sort of like set of clunky workarounds, whereas decentralization technology lets us bring the environment to the agent and say, hey, now you can interact with it. You don't have to pretend to be a person anymore. So it's like a merging of worlds, and I think that's fascinating. And it does just mean that technology is going to trend towards agents, essentially, without us having to specifically build them. I think it'll just happen.
Yeah, I mean, loved everything Ben said. It's exactly why we built OS, like agents, and particularly once you have multiple kinds of them of different flavors, and once you deal with multi-agent systems, becomes very interesting. I mean, human society is exactly that. Now we're just replicating it with machines, and as Ben said, like this autonomous agent, I guess, like is like sort of in a sense also the final product, because if you create them very well, you know they're going to get better, and ultimately you have whatever AGI and beyond. But that is it. It's the software that acts, does things on your behalf, and it's a lot of challenges there, and a lot of opportunities. If you want to, try this out today with OLAS, you can go to operate, well, either olas.network or operate.olas.network. You can run one yourself. We'll participate in prediction markets. There we have like hundreds of them already active every day. I think a couple of days ago we hit 10,000 transactions per day from these kind of agents, and that's a key example of like an open environment where different types of agents interact, all of it autonomous AI agents, and the outcomes are sort of prediction markets in which humans would never participate, but then these prediction markets can sort of be input for other AI agents' decision making or other AI or human-based systems.
I know Joel or Doug, if you guys have anything you'd plug. Otherwise, people can also start requesting if they have any questions for the group. Okay. Well, I mean, we have about 5 minutes left. If there's nothing else, I think we can wrap it here. But
I'll ask one question. Yeah, I think in Sam Altman's argument for the whole compute narrative, it's that we can pretty accurately project the demand for this stuff, where the lower the price, the higher the demand. And I can kind of see that, especially as these tools get embedded more and more in the tools that I'm just using every day. I no longer have to be a customer of Gemini or ChatGPT or Anthropic. I can more or less just use the tools I was already using, and it goes a level lower. So I guess it's two questions. One, do you all see it playing out that way? And will that be true in decentralization too? Do we see AI actually becoming embedded in decentralized protocols? We've kind of talked about it the other way, decentralized protocols becoming embedded in AI. And then two, do you all buy that narrative that this is a commodity that the cheaper we make it, the more society is going to use it?
Happy to jump in from my side. I guess in the inverse, totally buy the cheaper we make it, the more people will use it argument. Like the supply demand curve for ML compute, I think will be sort of the same as you would expect, basically, based on the dynamics of it. So I think we're definitely going to see that. In terms of AI being used in the decentralized context and like on chain and things like that within the crypto world, I think we're going to see that for the same reason as before. Just it's a progression of technology. It's just a better way of doing a lot of technical things. It's a better way of making certain technical decisions where before we would have to code it imperatively. Now we can code it probabilistically, and we can let it operate over many more scenarios, even zero shot scenarios that it's never dealt with before. Obviously, there's going to be a big sort of like trust chasm for us to cross when it comes to putting real world economic value behind that stuff. But I do think the world is going to have to go through a kind of imperative to probabilistic shift, which is weird because we went through it in the inverse. The world is probabilistic. We exist in this kind of like spectrum environment where like a lot of things aren't absolute. They are somewhere in the middle, and we accept that as humans. We accept it in day-to-day conversation. When we started building technology, we had to shift to an imperative view where we came to the kind of realization that things would be exactly how we've specified them. And we got used to that in our interactions with technology. But I do think that's flipping now. And you see it with self-driving cars. Like the idea that we find it really difficult to see a self-driving car making decisions where in a lot of scenarios, it's much safer than a person, but because it's not imperatively coded and exactly clear why it's done it, we find it quite weird. But I think we're the same as with self-driving cars. We'll have to overcome that as society. I think we'll have to overcome it in lots of other areas. And I think it will be this generational thing where eventually the newer generations will just, that's the world they'll exist in. They'll be used to things being probabilistic when they interact with them, and they'll be used to the idea that a model is making decisions based on the parameters it's being trained on, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be this like imperative flowchart that it's executed and we can interrogate it on a screen in this imperative way. It can actually be much more probabilistic.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining. This was an incredible discussion. Ben, David, Joel, Doug, thank you all, and Andrew. Thank you all for making the time. Really appreciate you all, sharing your thoughts and expertise in the space. And thanks for everyone who joined. Glad you were able to come spend some time with us.
Yep, thanks for hosting, Jonathan. Thanks everyone for having us. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.